Thank you, Lynn. So as Lynn said, I'm Rebecca Berry. I'm at Wokingham Borough Council. So Lynn's put the permissions on to, if you want to switch your cameras on, that's you're very welcome to. The reason I asked Lynn to allow people to switch their cameras on if they wanted is because it's quite nice to see people's expressions if you are happy to do so, just because then I can get feedback visually of if I'm boring you senseless or confusing you. It's quite nice to see faces. So if anyone would like to show me their faces, that would be lovely. Brilliant, there's a few, great. So I don't feel like I'm alone talking to a screen in my shed at the bottom of the garden. So that's great, thank you.
Sorry,
so
just
my
before
background,
you start, Becca, sorry, can I just check? We've got a question about whether the slides will be shared afterwards.
Yeah, they do get shared.
So they do.
Lynn,
lovely, thank you very
Lynn will
much.
be sharing them all out.
Thank you.
Ah, she's already put it on there.
Be roughly.
Lynn's already on it. So that's great. So yeah, if we could, lovely to see some faces, but if you're not speaking, just pop your mic on mute. We had a little sharing of some words that perhaps were not meant to be shared at the beginning. So my background is I've been in adult social care for 25 years. I know you say you don't look like you possibly have been working for 25 years, but yes, it's true. I also am a trustee for a domestic abuse charity in East Surrey. So I've been the domestic abuse lead for adult social care in another local authority for sort of 8 years or so. So I've done a lot of domestic abuse stuff and safeguarding. So my experience is through speaking to survivors, through direct work, and through my work in adult social care. So that's sort of what I bring to what we're talking about today. So obviously, it goes without saying, we're going to be talking about abuse today. We're going to be talking about domestic abuse. So be mindful that the content may well be triggering to you. When I was putting together this presentation, I was lucky enough to have worked with a survivor who has care and support needs. So as we go through this presentation, there are quite a few slides where it's what she told me. So it's her voice, what she actually said. So because of that, and because we're using real life examples, and we also talk about a domestic homicide review, so obviously in that situation, the worst outcome happened. So because of that, some of this information can be triggering, can bring up in ourselves things that we've experienced ourselves, things that our loved ones have experienced, or that we've dealt with through work. So do take time. Thankfully, it's a Friday afternoon, so hopefully you'll be able to take some time for self-love and care afterwards. But do reach out and seek appropriate support if you do find that you've been triggered. And the point of this as well, when we're talking about domestic abuse, we're not othering it. We're not saying, oh, we're talking about what happens to other people. Given the amount of people that we've got in this virtual room, the chances are that some of us have either been directly affected for ourselves or within our families, or that we know people. We've got family, we've got friends that have been directly affected by domestic abuse. So it's not about them, it's about us, about our experiences. So these are some information about local services. As Karen's put on the chat, the slides will be shared. And these are some national helplines where you can seek support around domestic abuse. And these are some other ones, national helplines, and for sort of specific around the LGBT community, and around a men's advice line as well. So that's where you can seek some support there. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at have a greater understanding about how care and support needs impact people's experience of domestic abuse. We don't have time today in an hour and a half slot. Sorry, could I ask whoever that is to put their mic on mute? I'm not sure if Karen or Lynn can see who's not got their mic muted. Let's have a look.
6 days, but there's no improvement. 29 minutes so far on hold as CQC.
Okay, lovely. So
someone tried calling them whilst I've been sat here.
Okay, so if we could try and put our mics on mute. Lovely.
Tuesday, Lee.
Oh,
Tuesday,
still
1:15.
Okay, so
Here we go, I was trying to spot the person.
thank you. Thank you. It is like whack-a-mole, isn't it? Working out where the mic's coming from. So we're not going to be, in an hour and a half, we're not going to be able to delve into the huge topic that is domestic abuse. I will be giving you a little bit of homework, as in I'll be pointing you to places, to research, to some links and things like that. So to allow you to delve deeper into domestic abuse, but we're not going to be able to cover the huge amount of information that there is around domestic abuse, but hopefully we're going to be touching a bit more on how people's care and support needs can be used within domestic abuse and how that they experience domestic abuse. We're going to dig in a bit more into what do we mean by somebody with care and support needs, and therefore get a greater understanding about the law in safeguarding, and to know when to make a referral or to progress to Section 42 when there's the presence of domestic abuse. And that's our task this afternoon. So the Domestic Abuse Act came into force, or was passed, in 2021. And it gave us a clearer definition of what we mean by domestic abuse. And particularly pertinent was this whole thing about personally connected to one another, to each other, because we know that historically people, when they're thinking about domestic abuse, they think about intimate partners. They think about people who've been in a relationship together, not necessarily thinking about adult children to parents, not thinking about siblings, not thinking about cousins, aunts, whatever other personal connection there might have been. And the definition in there also includes people who have had a child together, even if they haven't been in a relationship, people who've co-parented. And it is aged 16 or over. So it crosses into those that are under 18 that would be looked at within the children's framework. Importantly, when it talks about behaviour as abusive, if it consists of any of the following. So again, the movement away from calling things domestic violence is because previously people were kind of thinking in quite a narrow way that it was around the violence, but actually sometimes, and we'll look at this as we go along, sometimes violence might not actually be present. It's the whole toolkit, the whole gambit of abuse that can involve any of these elements. So we're trying to move away from using domestic violence because I think that minimises, and we're not really tucking into what we actually mean about the whole spectrum of abuse. So on that note, what is coercive and controlling behaviour? It's now a criminal offence under the Serious Crime Act 2015. It's now recognised as the most prominent behaviour that underpins the majority of domestic abuse cases. A pattern of behaviour which seeks to minimise a person's freedom, their freedom for action, and their human rights. So it's now a criminal offence, and if found guilty, a perpetrator can have a maximum of 5 years in prison, fine, or both. And to sort of clarify the difference, so controlling behaviour is a range of acts that they're designed to make the person subordinate or dependent, isolating them from other sources of support, exploiting their resources and their capacities for personal gain, depriving them of the means for independence, for resistance, for escape, and to have regulation over their own everyday behaviour. And coercive behaviour is a pattern or acts of assault, threats, humiliation, intimidation, or any other abuse that's used to harm, punish, or frighten the person. So again, it doesn't have to be within the context of violence. And if we think this is your first bit of homework. Evan Stark, if you Google Evan Stark and look on YouTube, you'd be able to find tons of his videos, and they're all really interesting. He's a really interesting speaker, and he was involved when the coercion and control criminal offence was being drafted, and he's very interesting to hear speak. And what he's saying is not only is coercive control the most common context in which women are abused, it's also the most dangerous. And that is borne out in the research that Jane Monckton Smith did. Some of you may have heard of this already. The picture there of in control dangerous relationships and how they end in murder that's the front cover of her book. That's in my special bookcase, and is really worth reading. Very easy. It's not a dry bit of research. It's got stories and survivors' voices, and it's really interesting. But from that research, she was able to pull out the 8 stages, the homicide timeline. So the 8 stages that a relationship goes through. So she looked at cases of homicide in the context of domestic abuse over a number of years, and she found that they all but 2 had these 8 stages in a relationship. We're not going to go through that today, but that's your bit of homework to look at that, the 8 stages. And I see that Karen's put some stuff in there on the chat. But one of the things that she found was the presence of coercion and control in every single case where, unfortunately, the outcome at the end was murder. So what it looks like in reality, it's a continuous course of conduct, and this is where the law previously, where it was very much incident based, where it was looking at assault, wasn't really cutting it when we were looking at tackling domestic abuse, because you may have an assault where someone has bent back someone's finger and broken their finger. If you're looking at that being dealt with in terms of an individual assault, that's not going to be a very serious crime. That's not going to hold it within it a type of punishment that actually meets what that in the context of coercion and control. That is just another way of exerting I have the ability to hurt you, whereas actually that's on the background of all of these sorts of measures which have restricted that person's free will to live. The abuse is personalised, and this is especially relevant when we're talking about people with care and support needs, because often, and we'll talk about it in a minute, often the person's care and support needs themselves are used as a way of control. It's worth commenting on the gendered nature of domestic abuse. Certainly with intimate partner relationships, it is predominantly committed by men. Sometimes 2 men, sometimes more often for women. And when we'll talk about interfamilial abuse, there's less of a gender role there. Sometimes survivors may not be aware that it is abuse. It might be that they have a belief that this is what a relationship is like, because that view has been created by the perpetrator. So how might a perpetrator use care and support needs against somebody? These are some of the examples that I've experienced as I've worked within the domestic abuse context. Belittling. Nobody else would want you. You're lucky that somebody wants to be with someone like you. Minimising. She has mental health problems. Restricting access to medication, therefore impacting that person's health. Not supporting or not allowing support for someone with washing and dressing. So therefore that's impacting someone's sense of self, someone's sense of well-being. Taking away continence products. We'll hear about a case study later, which was a person that I worked with, where the husband had removed all of her knickers, and therefore she didn't have the ability to use continence products because there was nowhere for her to put them. And if you imagine, because you can't use your continence products, that's going to impact how far you can go away from home, or whether you actually want to leave the house at all, because you could be humiliated by having a continence accident while you were out. So that's what I mean about the personalisation of abuse. Not taking to health appointments. And this is important to remember when we're thinking about how we're recording our information. If we're putting Mrs. Jones didn't turn up to her health appointment, we're not acknowledging that actually Mrs. Jones might not be able to get to that health appointment on her own. So actually, it's not that Mrs. Jones hasn't turned up to her health appointment. It's that she wasn't brought to her health appointment. So I'm just going to ask Karen for help with finding the person that needs to be muted. Other
You're muted now, Rebecca.
Thanks, Leanne. I'm not the one that needs muting. Thank you. Yeah, gaslighting, exacerbating mental health. Sometimes that is a powerful tool that perpetrators can use for dementia. No, what are you talking about? You didn't forget that, or that's not what you said, or, you know, you've left that stuff there again, when actually it's about that person trying to make that person feel like their dementia is worse than it is, or their mental health is worse than it is. Not allowing equipment in the house. And sometimes when we're thinking about a situation that we're seeing, this is where it's really important to think about hypotheses at the beginning. When we're starting to work in these situations, are we seeing a carer who actually has a bit of a lack of understanding of the equipment and the impact that that will have on their house? You know, I'm sure we've all heard potentially someone saying, God, I don't want all that ugly stuff in my lovely living room. I don't want that on my staircase. It's going to look awful. And that's, though, you know, those are reasonable things to say. We all, you know, don't necessarily want a great big commode in the middle of the living room. But where we're thinking about, is that about that, or is it about somebody restricting that person's freedom? Is that about that humiliation, that restricting what that person needs, minimizing their ability to get out and about? Taking full control of care services. One thing we need to be really mindful of is grooming of professionals. Often perpetrators can present themselves as the most wonderful, caring daughter, husband, son. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. She's very difficult. He's very difficult. She hits out. You know, I know you understand this. You know, you social workers, you police officers, you nurses, you're all so wonderful. I don't know how you can do this work. That's the sort of thing that we would see if there's professionals being groomed. So just be mindful of that. This one is a really powerful. You couldn't look after the children alone. That can be one of the most powerful ways for somebody with some element of disability, mental health, learning disability. They will have had people raise concerns potentially in the past. How are you going to manage looking after the children on your own? And often perpetrators can use that. The only reason they're letting you keep the kids is because I'm here. You couldn't do it on your own. If you tell anyone, they'll get social services around here, and then they'll take the kids away from you. You won't have the kids to look after. And that is and we'll hear from our survivor's voice as we go through, that can be an incredibly powerful tool to silence people. So the first thing that our survivor's telling us is, I didn't think of myself as being vulnerable or having needs. And that's where it's up to us to sort of unpick that and work out what somebody's daily life is like. A lot of you will have seen this, the power and control wheel, but this one, and as I said, you'll get the slides. It might be a little bit too small to see on the screen, but this is particularly changing it so that it's about people that have care and support needs, and about care workers and carers, how they might use power and control for somebody that has care and support needs. So you might have something like punishing or ridiculing, using medication to sedate the person for convenience, ignoring equipment or safety requirements, denying the physical or emotional pain of people with disabilities, justifying rules and limiting autonomy. You know, I'm doing this for her own good, sort of thing. Talking about how I can't care for myself is difficult and embarrassing. And, you know, I remember when I first started working in social care 24 years ago, I remember thinking, I can't believe they're asking me to phone up people and ask them about how they wash and dress themselves, asking them how they wipe their bottoms. This is extraordinary, but very soon you get used to it as a professional. You know, as health professionals, as social care professionals, we get really used to just asking these questions. And I think sometimes we can forget how difficult it is, especially for people who are survivors of domestic abuse and are every single day trying to prove to themselves their own worth and their own value, for them to be able to then flip that around and say, actually, I'm struggling here, is a really difficult conversation. And we need to be patient with people and understand why perhaps they might not be telling us the full extent of their care and support needs. Another bit of homework. Safe Lives is a brilliant website, and they're very much involved in lots of the MARAC practice. And they do particular spotlights. And this particular one is around older people and domestic abuse. So I'm putting my shawl on, I'm getting a bit chilly again. And as you can see, there are some interesting statistics here that older victims are less likely to attempt to leave in the year before accessing help and are more likely to be living with the perpetrator. And so when we're working with older people, that's that element that actually it's planning how you may get to see that person on your own, because they're more likely to be living with the perpetrator. So that takes some careful planning. Older victims are significantly more likely to have a disability. So do have a look at that, Safe Lives. That's just the sort of the headline slide that comes with it. But there is a whole report there, which is really interesting and has some information about tips for working with older people. And again, there is another one on disabled survivors. Disabled victims typically experience abuse for a longer period of time. Disabled victims are more likely to report abuse from multiple perpetrators. And disabled people who are experiencing domestic abuse are twice as likely to have attempted or previously planned or attempted suicide. And the bit at the top there, the top right, disabled women are twice as likely to experience domestic abuse than non-disabled women. So if we think about the cohort of the people that we're working with, they're double as likely to be experiencing or have experienced domestic abuse than the wider population. So even more than the people in this room, when we think about the proportion that have probably experienced domestic abuse, if the client group that we're working with are twice as likely to have experienced or be currently experiencing domestic abuse. So it's likely to be there. I mentioned it at the beginning, the personally connected to each other can mean any of these things. And we're really good or getting better at services of recognising domestic abuse when it's intimate partner. We're not so good at thinking, oh, could it be one of these other people that are caring? Again, going back to our grooming professionals, the wonderful sister who cares for her sister. You know, thinking about other interfamilial relationships. And there was a bit of work done by the Mayor's Office in January 2020. And again, it was looking at homicides, but it was looking at a thematic review of all homicides across London. So there's loads of stuff in there about, you know, gang violence and all of that kind of stuff. But particularly interesting for us was about where it was in the context of adult family abuse. And of the cases they looked at, in all but 2 cases, the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator was that of parent and child. 4 were mothers killed by sons, 2 were fathers killed by sons, 1 father was killed by his daughter, and the remaining 2 cases were of siblings. So the majority in this category were over 65, so the older people that a lot of us work with. Nearly all the perpetrators in the cases of adult family violence had serious mental health problems, and in 1 case, the perpetrator also had a learning disability. So thinking about our risk, what our risk looks like, in 6 of the cases reviewed, there was a caring relationship between the victim and perpetrator. So that goes back to our not assuming we know what we're seeing. Where we've got something coming to our attention, we need to be thinking, is this a carer breakdown or is this domestic abuse? And our work with people needs to think that it could be both, because we don't know on the presenting information. So we might be working with someone to support that person's care, the carer's needs through an assessment under Section 10 from the local authority, and looking to improve the life for that carer. But it doesn't mean we're also not thinking, I need to speak to this person on their own. What's going on? Are there things that are telling me that there could be coercion and control? There could be domestic abuse going on here. And what the research found, that often there were behaviours that met the definition of domestic abuse, but because people weren't seeing it through the lens of domestic abuse, they weren't recognising it was, and therefore weren't treating it like that. So, you know, in the most basic of terms, you might get a referral coming through about a son and a father, where there's potential financial abuse, there's emotional abuse, there's physical abuse, and you've got a relationship, and you've got those three factors, which are domestic abuse, but not marrying them up and calling it domestic abuse means that you might act in a different way. So how does this all fit into safeguarding? So safeguarding means protecting an adult's right to live in safety, free from abuse and neglect. People and organisations working together to prevent and stop both the risks and the experience of abuse and neglect. So that's transferable to domestic abuse, isn't it? You know, we absolutely would want to be doing that in domestic abuse. And in case I haven't bored you already at the beginning of the week with the Section 42 of the Care Act, it comes in three parts. A local authority who's got reasonable cause to suspect that an adult in its area, whether or not they normally live there or not, has needs for care and support, and again, can't emphasise enough whether the local authority is meeting them or not, is experiencing or at risk of abuse and neglect, and as a result of those needs is unable to protect themselves, the local authority must make or cause to be made whatever inquiries it thinks necessary. So that is about the duty under safeguarding. And sometimes we're good at the first bit. So if we think about needs for care and support is experiencing or risk of abuse and neglect, sometimes, and especially with domestic abuse, when we're applying the third bit, which is as a result of those needs, are they unable to protect themselves? And I can't tell you how many times I've seen a decision recorded, we're not going to do a Section 42 inquiry because they're able to protect themselves because they were able to call the police. And a way of thinking about this, I might be having a swim and I start to get into difficulty because I can't swim, in fact. And I am waving to the shore saying, help, help, I'm drowning. Just because I'm able to tell the person on the beach that I'm drowning doesn't magically mean that I'm somehow now able to swim. I'm able to tell you I'm drowning, but it doesn't mean that I'm now telling you I'm magically able to swim. Does that make sense? So I've used the poem there, but just being able to call the police doesn't necessarily mean that you're able to protect yourself. And, you know, I would argue sometimes when we're thinking about domestic abuse, the 42 of the Care Act, there's a causal link between the need for care and support. So as a result of those needs, are they unable to protect themselves? Well, you could argue that people without care and support needs are unable to protect themselves from domestic abuse. It's an insidious crime, which we're all vulnerable to. So if you add into that mix that somebody has care and support needs, which can be used to perpetrate that abuse, you could argue that actually the third point of Section 42 is almost a moot point because nobody is able to protect themselves from domestic abuse. And certainly just by waving from the sea, you're not protecting yourself, you're just alerting someone that that's going on. I've highlighted obviously domestic violence is listed in the Care Act definitions, and because it was drafted in 2014. So, the Care Act needs to move on and call it domestic abuse, but for now, that's what we've got. But it is a defined category in the Care Act. Our survivor, coming back to our survivor, had said that the police and other agencies did not recognise me as being vulnerable. And we know often people's vulnerabilities, people's disabilities, people's care and support needs can be invisible. And it's up to us as practitioners to be aware, to ask the right questions, to recognise when that might be. So Sky has helpfully given us a bit of a direction when we're thinking about who might have care and support needs. So there's some problems in this because, you know, an older person might not necessarily have care and support needs. This is more of an indication. These are the groups who may be more likely to have care and support needs. So it's not a sort of qualification that once you reach 65 and can be declared as an older person that you automatically have care and support needs, but it's an indication of these are the sorts of groups that may make you more likely to have care and support needs. One of the categories that we are sometimes not so good at recognising that care and support needs come from is somebody who misuses substances or alcohol to the extent it affects their ability to manage day-to-day living. Sometimes we're really good at recognising care and support needs for somebody who has a physical disability, but we might not be so good at recognising those with substance misuse or mental health conditions. Care and support being a mixture of practical, financial and emotional support for adults who need help to manage their lives and be independent, including older people, people with a disability or long-term illness, people with mental health problems and carers. So that's what the statutory care and support guidance tells us that care and support means. And for those of you that work for adult social care, these will be very familiar to you. So when an assessment of somebody's care and support needs is undertaken by local authority, they will be doing that under Section 9 of the Care Act. Sometimes it's called different things, an ASCA, an adult social care assessment, a needs assessment, whatever it's called, it's still a Section 9 assessment. And you'd be applying the eligibility criteria regulations. And so these are the things that somebody would be looking at about care and support needs. You know, how does somebody manage their nutrition, personal hygiene, toilet needs, being appropriately clothed, making use of their home safely, managing a habitable environment, developing and maintaining family or personal relationships, accessing and engaging in work, training, education, using the community and caring responsibilities for a child. And again, a bit like when we're thinking about where we're more likely to recognise care and support needs within groups of people, I think sometimes we're better at recognising the top group. We're better at knowing personal care needs. Oh, right, yeah, they can't wash and dress themselves. What we're not so good at is thinking, right, they've got care and support needs because actually they're struggling to parent, or actually they're struggling to access the community. So that there's no weighting. The top ones are not more important than the bottom. So this, if you're coming across people that may have that their needs are impacting on those outcomes, then we could be saying that they've got care and support needs and therefore would trigger the duty for a safeguarding response. I thought that if I told people how much I struggled, that they would say I couldn't look after my child. So that's the dichotomy, really, isn't it? You're wanting someone to tell you what they're struggling with so they can prove to you that they've got care and support needs and therefore they're hitting the duty for a Section 42 inquiry or to get services and whatever it is, but struggling. And we know that perpetrators can often use this as a tool to say, if you tell them what's wrong with you, then they won't let you look after your child. So you've got somebody that's torn. They want to say what they're struggling with to get the help, but if they tell you what they're struggling with, potentially that's going to have an impact, and you're going to say they've got that belief then that they're going to say you can't look after their child. When a Section 42 inquiry is triggered, these are the objectives that we're told in the law that inquiry needs to do. So first and foremost, finding out what the person's views and wishes are. What do they want to happen? Assessing their needs, which is where we get the Section 9 assessment part in, support and redress and how they might be met. protection from abuse and neglect in accordance with their wishes, making decisions about following up actions, and enable them to achieve resolution and recovery. So if we think about them and we think about it in the context of domestic abuse, there's quite a lot that we can do there, isn't there? There's quite a lot of actions or things that are relevant to domestic abuse. Now, this is one of my favourite bits of the Care Act, if you can have a favourite bit of the Care Act. Got section 11A and B, 2A and B. So we've already talked a bit about a section 9 assessment and assessment of needs. So I could go to anyone and say, hello, would you like an assessment of your care and support needs under section 9? And they could happily say to me, no, thank you very much, Rebecca, go away. And they have that right to do so because of section 11. So they can refuse an assessment and the local authority is not required to do it if they say no. Then we bring in 2A and 2B, which says if the person lacks capacity to refuse the assessment and the local authority is satisfied it would be in their best interests, then the local authority has to do it anyway. The bit that's pertinent for us today is if the adult is experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect, that also takes away that ability to refuse, which means that it imposes a duty on the local authority to undertake that assessment, whether or not they refuse or not. So if we go back to thinking about reasons why somebody might be reluctant to tell us about their care and support needs, it's going back to they're going to think that I can't look after my children. I'm reluctant to say just how much I'm not managing because actually I've been being told how useless I am and I don't want to tell people. So that brings in, so if we've got, sometimes we may have somebody that is refusing for reasons of keeping themselves safe, because we know that sometimes the very involvement of professionals can be a trigger to escalation in risk, can be an escalation in the abuse from the perpetrator. So when we're working with people, they are experts in their own risk. I can't say this enough. If somebody says, I'm scared that they're going to kill me, believe them, because they are managing that risk every day. We have our risk management tools, we have our, matrices and all of that sort of stuff, but we're not the experts in that person's risk, they are. So they might be saying to us, no, I don't want an assessment, go away, because they are concerned about the escalation in risk. And so therefore, what that might do is that we undertake the assessment as far as possible. And that might mean going to different organisations that are involved with that person and just trying to get a picture so that it allows us to become better at knowing what the risk is for that person and what their care and support needs are and how we might be able to support them. Does that make sense? I wanted to be helped to advocate for myself within a system that's often adversarial rather than supportive. And for any of us that have tried to support a relative or friend to access health, adult social care, this whole system that we work in, when you take off your professional hat and you try and negotiate it from the point of view of a member of the public, we realise it's quite complicated and there's lots of things that we need to get our head round. And so for people that are trying to work out, where am I at here? Are they doing an assessment of my needs? Am I under a safeguarding inquiry? Sometimes people want to be helped to understand that and support them in the system rather than taking over. And by another bit of homework, if you Google Change That Lasts, it was brought together by Women's Aid. And what they did was started training professionals around the trusted professional intervention. And the idea is that it's needs-led, strength-based, and that fits in really well with our making safeguarding personal objectives. That we need to be asking for the person what's important for you in this situation, and not coming in with the kind of view, what needs to happen in this situation is this person needs to no longer live in the same property as the person that's abusing them. This is what needs to happen. Our ideas of what needs to happen for this situation, for that person to be safer. It might be, there's a particular case study we'll talk about in a minute where it might be less, there might be reasons why it's more important for that person to remain in the property with the perpetrator, but they want stuff put in place to make them safer within that situation. So we need to be listening to what people are telling us, what survivors are telling us, what they need and what their strengths are, because they will have had their strengths taken away by the perpetrator. So thinking about local authority response, there are two bits. We talked about section 42, that's making a decision whether section 42 is triggered. And often that can be about deciding what other people are going to do. You know, it says that the outcome of the section 42 inquiry is deciding what actions they or other organisations are going to take. For deciding what adult social care is going to do is the section 9 assessment, which sometimes happens whether or not the person has refused it because of section 11. So you don't do an assessment under section 11. Section 11 tells you have to do the section 9, whether that person refuses or not. So if adult social care are involved, whether that be through section 42, section 9 or section 10, these are the sorts of things that adult social care would be looking at doing. So we've got, it might be about providing care through care agencies or personal assistance paid for by direct payments. And what that can do is remove, when we talked about at the beginning, how perpetrators can use people's care and support needs to control, that might be about removing the ability of the perpetrator to have the control over somebody's daily life, the personal care, incontinence care, all of that sort of stuff. Equipment to assist with daily living, increase independence, day services, getting them away from the perpetrator, supported living, residential nursing home, or signposting to other services. So it's the tool bag that is already there for when we're assessing someone's care and support needs in general, but often through a domestic abuse lens, it's about taking away the ability of the perpetrator to have control over those things. I didn't want a care agency with lots of people in and out knowing where I lived. Our safety was the priority. So the survivor that I spoke to said that she was thought of as being a bit difficult. She had said, no, you know, we know that personal assistants are quite difficult to source. This person was saying, I don't want loads of different people in and out of the house because we're not that far away from where we fled from the perpetrator. The more people that get to know where I live, the more chances are that he's going to find out where I live. So actually, I want one person that's coming in and doing that support. And what she told me was that she felt that she was made to feel like she was being difficult because it was easier to source an agency. And so that bit is about asking why. Why don't you want a care agency? And then she gives that absolutely reasonable explanation, which is about the safety of her and her child. So we're going to move a bit more into our case examples here. An example here, it was an occupational therapist went and visited a woman who had MS. She lived with her ex-partner. They jointly owned the house and neither wished to sell the house or move out. She said that it was really important to her. She wouldn't be able to get a mortgage now. It was really important to her that she continued to live in her own property that she owned. He'd also, something had happened with his employment, which meant that he wouldn't have been able to get another mortgage either. So both of them were at a standstill. Neither of them were going to prepare to sell the house and move out. At the time when the OT visited, he was providing care for her, meal preparation, administering medication. She told the OT that he'd been leaving her in soiled clothes, withholding her medication and food. He was controlling, had a terrible temper before she became unwell, but that things had got worse. Making safeguarding a personal and that needs-led strength-based approach, her desired outcomes were explored, and a disabled facilities grant was secured, which adapted her kitchen to allow her to make her own meals. A support plan was put in place to provide care so she wasn't so reliant on him, and her outcomes were met and the situation was improved for her. One of the things he also did, he would go out of the house and put the thermostat down to the lowest level. and leave the house. And because she was a wheelchair user and it was high up on the wall, she wasn't able to get to it. So when he was out, she was freezing cold and she had no way of changing that. And what the OT looked at sourcing was getting one of those like Nest, or other ones are available, so that she was able to control the heating from her phone. So she had control over that. So whilst she still remained in the same property as the perpetrator, his power was diminished because he no longer had control over the medication, the support, the temperature, the equipment, her access to the community, all of that sort of stuff. So it was listening to her and what was important to her. And don't assume that I cannot do anything. Don't take over everything. Find my strengths. What can people do? What will support that person to find their strength again? And this example is the person that we've been hearing about, her voice as we've gone through. Woman in her 20s with both existing health needs and further needs caused by the abuse from her husband, horrendous abuse, which has left her with a permanent disability, fled with her child. She has contact with children's services, police, mental health services, domestic outreach services and health services, all of whom were aware that she was fleeing domestic abuse and were aware of the impact on her health needs of her daily life. At no point did professionals recognise her as having care and support needs, and no referrals were made to adult social care, so therefore no safeguarding inquiry was undertaken. There was a significant delay in her receiving the support she needed. She was then supported by a personal assistant for 28 hours a week, who provided support with personal care, nutrition, cleaning, and all other activities of daily life, allowing her to parent her child. So by all of those other things being left cared for, she was able to parent. But it just goes to show 28 hours a week is not an insubstantial amount of support that she required. So for that not to have been recognised at the very beginning, and what she told me was that being eloquent was a barrier, because people thought because she could express herself that she didn't need help. She was actually a registered health professional before her injuries at the hands of her perpetrator had meant that she had to stop work. So she was very eloquent, and what was happening was people were mistaking that for her having, oh, she's all right, she's talking, you know, she's telling us all sorts of stuff, she speaks very well and is very able to tell us about what she is able to do. Therefore there was no digging deeper to look at what support she might need. She found it exhausting. If she did reach out for help, then where they were thinking, oh, you're able to manage things yourself, they were saying, all right, well, let us know how you're getting on. Call us back tomorrow, let us know how you're getting on. And if you've got that conversation going on with all the different elements of the system, children's services, police, adult social care, domestic abuse outreach, GP, that's like a full-time job, isn't it? Having conversations with all of those people. And what Section 42 of the Care Act allows us to do with the local authority as a coordinating authority is perhaps work out, you know, who's going to be the one person that speaks to her and doesn't overwhelm this survivor with all of us wanting to, we're discharging our own duty here. I've got a duty that I've got to do my Section 9 assessment, and I've got a duty that I need to look at her equipment, and I've got a duty where I need to check her skin integrity, and I've got a duty I need to make sure that that non-molestation order's going. Imagine that many phone calls in a day. That's overwhelming. And so sometimes when survivors disengage, it's not because actually they're saying, I don't want your services. It's because they're exhausted with us, because we're all wanting to do our own little bit. Sometimes it's about us working together. How can we combine those conversations and other services get the information from us that they need to discharge their own duties? And this is another one where two men, both with learning disabilities, were married. They lived together in supported living accommodation with 24-hour support. And actually, it was a beautiful piece of work because they'd met each other at a day service. They were both funded by two different local authorities, and the two local authorities coordinated to enable a support package for them to have a joint support package to live together in supported living, which those who know about support package knows that that is no mean feat for two local authorities to work together and provide this support to allow these two men to live together. Was a beautiful piece of work. However, the mother of one of them has control of her son's finances and calls constantly, dictating to the support workers where and when the son and husband go out. She doesn't approve of their same-sex relationship. And what she was doing was visiting the home frequently, and she would storm in to the bedroom and she'd pull the sheet back to see whether they'd been sleeping in the same bed and whether there was evidence of sexual intercourse. If she was challenged by the staff, she would be verbally abusive to them, to her son, and to the husband. And the bit of work, it was triggered Section 42 under domestic abuse. And again, we might not think about that as domestic abuse. We might think about it as an abusive, controlling, overbearing mother. But by dealing with it through domestic abuse, it looks at our lens. It makes our lens different. So the police, outreach, support workers, they supported the couple to set clear boundaries with her, explain what was important to them, give them autonomy, and it's including in terms of relationship, because the son said, I still want to have contact with her, but I want it to be on my terms. I don't want her to be dictating what my life is like and what my relationship with my husband is like. So it's not about complete exclusion of perpetrators sometimes, it's about removing their ability to control and abuse. So so much homework. There's another lovely bit of research, which was done by Aberystwyth University. I was a bit paranoid about pronouncing that because Karen's on the call, might not have got my pronunciation right. But this is a great piece of research, and what this comes from it, and what it says is across the world, domestic abuse affects 1 in 3 women, and every 3 seconds somebody develops dementia. So likelihood is those are going to be bumping into each other. Yet despite the prevalence of both these issues, little attention is given to what happens when they're combined. As a result, older people living with dementia are often the forgotten survivors of domestic abuse. Dementia can result in a lack of inhibition. So whereas previously a victim survivor may have deliberately hidden their abuse from people, having developed dementia, they may talk openly about their experiences, causing a perpetrator to be fearful of public exposure or prosecution. So the experts in their own lives and risk develop dementia and have less of an ability to manage that risk, which therefore increases the risk. And it works the flip side as well. Sometimes you can have perpetrators who then develop dementia, and where they've been quite clever at hiding their abuse previously, then that starts to kind of come out into the public sphere more. It was a few years ago, I went to a conference about domestic abuse, and there was an outreach service that was talking, and they were saying, we don't work with incidents of domestic abuse where one or other have dementia, because they're not, they can't give a good description. And actually, if the perpetrator's got dementia, they're not actually perpetrating abuse, it's part of their dementia. When you think about it, you've got a couple that's lived together for, they've been married for 50 years. The wife has consistently been abusive the entire married life, and now she's developed dementia. That doesn't mean that it's still, the abuse isn't still being perpetrated. It's just that that person's got dementia and it may be being shown in different ways. So an example, which is probably my favourite case in my entire career, was this one. So a day centre for people with dementia reported that a woman's husband and carer appeared overbearing, wouldn't let her out of his sight, and declined any services that meant them being separate. So, often in dementia, day services, you might have an activity for the carer and the cared for person, which allows that cared for person to have some time away. He would not allow her to get involved in that. He spoke about her disrespectfully and at times became quite aggressive with staff. He actually pushed over one of the members of staff. She presented as having really advanced dementia and limited speech. Her husband was very resistant and wouldn't let any workers speak to her alone. Adult social care. So we established a relationship with him as the carer and established trust to the point that eventually he allowed the social worker to take her to see a different dementia day centre. At that point, she got in the car and it was like she'd pulled off a mask and was suddenly very communicative and able to really disclose high levels of coercion and control and abuse and violence from her husband. Her presentation of being almost non-verbal and very, far gone dementia was actually her way of protecting herself, because if he felt that she couldn't disclose to anyone, then that made him feel safer. But in fact, she was funny, she was sarcastic, she was able to disclose awful restriction of food. This is the example with the taking away of the pants, so not allowing her to have continence products. So on these trips to the day centre, the social worker and this lady hatched a plot, which was that we would continue to work with him, where we were doing carers assessments and talking about how he needed to have support to have a break from his caring role. And as part of that was to have respite. And the plan was when she went to respite, she wouldn't go home. And during these trips to the day centre, she was also making contact with her sons again, who he had restricted all contact with, her sons and her grandchildren. And she was able to establish contact and put together a plot. Unfortunately, on the day that the plan was to come to fruition, he kind of got, I don't know what it was, he got wind of it. He worked out something was going on, and he exploded. Cut a long story short, we had to return with the police, and she was able to say, I do want to go with you, I do want to come out. And he was kept in the kitchen with the police. And as she was going out, she looked over, she was tiny, she looked over the police officer's shoulder and said to him, I'm going dancing. And then off she went into the police car with us. And I did say to her, oh, I'm terribly sorry, we're going to be going to respite in the back of the police car, because my car's back at the office. She went, oh, won't be the first time, love, and gave me a wink. And that is somebody that is presenting as that level of dementia. So sometimes survivors can use mental health dementia as an ability to screen themselves from a protective shield from the abuser. And we talked about this at the beginning. Sometimes a survivor with dementia, perpetrators of domestic abuse, can deliberately act to cause confusion and disorientation. So this is gaslighting plus, undermining capacity, promoting fears that they'll not be believed. And a perpetrator with increased physical frailty and dependency should not be viewed as posing less risk to a victim survivor. Because, as lots of survivors tell us, sometimes the violence isn't the worst of it. And so if a perpetrator is now physically frail, it doesn't mean that they're still not able to exert that coercion and control. I was listening to The Archers this week, where there's the domestic abuse storyline, and the mother of Helen said, as long as he is able to speak words, he's still able to hurt her. And I see Josephine is a fellow Archers fan, but I thought that was really resonant. As long as he is still able to speak, as long as he's still able to utter words, he will still be able to hurt her, because he was dying. People think he's caring and attentive. They think he's under stress because of looking after me. And that the thread that's running through here is having that idea in these situations at the beginning, is this a carer under strain or is this domestic abuse? And keeping those two channels in mind while we're undertaking our work with people. There are people that are carers under strain that can sometimes hit out. Those absolutely are valid situations, but we need to think, is that what's going on here? Or are we looking at a pattern of behaviour, of control, of subjugation? Going back to what I said at the beginning, sometimes we're less likely to notice when people have care and support needs that arise from substance or alcohol misuse. And in this case, we've got a woman who was being abused by her then partner. They both drank and took drugs. She was not an addict when she met him. He very much encouraged her intake. When she realised she was being abused, she was an addict. So by the time she worked out what was going on, she was already addicted. She has said numerous times that when she tried to disclose, she was seen as the problem woman rather than the woman with a problem. No one ever saw past her addiction. She was highly vulnerable and trying to get clean when she left. However, she was given accommodation in a mixed hostel and was sexually assaulted whilst there. She now lives clean, sober, and is an outreach worker. And if we think, hopefully quite a few of you have been able to see the Lads Like Us sessions that have happened today, this week through Safeguarding Week. This speaks to trauma-informed practice, doesn't it? Because if we see people that use substances as making them less reliable witnesses to what they're going through, we're not looking through the trauma-informed lens that actually people who are abusing substances are often doing so to deal with the abuse that they've experienced or are experiencing. So it can be actually an indicator of the fact that there's something going on. And it's wonderful that that person is now an advocate for other people that are experiencing domestic abuse. And it's a barrier to them seeking, again, going back to, they will say that I can't look after my child. If you tell anyone about this, I'm going to tell them that you are on drugs, I'm going to tell them about your drinking. They're going to take your kids away. Which takes us to Mary, which is a domestic homicide review and an adult safeguarding review that was conducted in Reigate and Banstead. This was a domestic homicide review. They can be conducted in the context of where somebody has taken their own life, as well as within homicide. So Mary died in 2017. At an inquest into her death, the coroner found that she tied a ligature around her neck and died by hanging. She drank considerable amounts of alcohol and taken cocaine. It's not possible to determine whether she intended to kill herself. In the months leading to her death, she'd contacted the police on 14 occasions, reporting that her relationship had become abusive and violent. In the period before she died, her oldest child went to live with his father and her two youngest children were taken into foster care. There were 5 occasions where events were reported to adult social care that should have been recognised as an adult safeguarding concern, which met the 3-part criteria. So there should have been an adult safeguarding inquiry, and 2 of those referrals explicitly mentioned coercion and control. What had happened and what adult social care took as the learning that they needed from that case was that they got confused. And for those that came to my session on Monday, I spoke about this. There was a confusion between, when we use the word safeguarding as a standalone noun, we get confused between saying, is this a safeguarding concern? Has section 42 been met to undertake an inquiry? Was there abuse or neglect? And in this case, adult social care treated the referral of somebody as a safeguarding concern as a referral for assessment. So for a referral of assessment under section 9. But, you know, we've just heard she called the police 14 times and there were 5 occasions and 2 of them explicitly mentioned coercion and control. So that's enough to give us our abuse bit, isn't it? So they didn't carry out an assessment, even though they knew that she was experiencing a risk of abuse. And what we know, we've talked about section 11 here, haven't we? So even if you didn't think, okay, it's section 42 has been triggered, you've got somebody where referrals have been made into adult social care saying this person's got care and support needs. We know that they're experiencing abuse. Therefore, even if she says, no, go away, expert in her own risk, no, go away, that adult social care should have carried out those section 9 assessments regardless because of section 11(2)(b). So asking questions, this is the answer to, I said to the survivor who's helped me with this, is there something that you want people to know? And she said, ask the questions. Ask, do you have any health or mental health needs? Are there things you're struggling with? So where if somebody makes a disclosure around domestic abuse, you're thinking about the two areas. Do they have care and support needs? So what can I do as a professional? Get training in domestic abuse. This is the tip of the iceberg, and Karen will be able to share her full plethora of domestic abuse training that's available locally, and also do your homework from today. Notice the signs, be aware of how to make a safe inquiry. So safe inquiries meaning ensuring the potential perpetrator is not and will not easily become aware of the concerns. Make sure you ask survivors about any health conditions or care and support needs. If you think someone may have care and support needs and may be experiencing domestic abuse, make the referral to adult social care. The law's clear. It's not, you don't have to be definitely clear they've definitely got care and support needs, and you don't have to be definitely clear that they're experiencing domestic abuse. If you think they might, make the referral to adult social care. Make sure referrals to adult social care fully, can describe as much as possible care and support needs. Sometimes a bit of flashing lights. We just saw from the Mary example, things sometimes might not get picked up. In adult social care, be alert to care and support needs that are less obvious. Be prepared to challenge. Not everybody gets everything right all of the time. If that was the case, we wouldn't have safeguarding adult reviews. We wouldn't have domestic homicide reviews. If you are making referrals into local authorities and you feel now you're armed with all the knowledge of Section 911 and Section 42, be prepared to challenge. Recognising different needs for methods for people with care and support needs, which might be more time, communication needs, all of those sorts of things, working with other organisations, and adult social care and children's services recognising each other's statutory duties. So for Mary, the DHR we just looked at, children's services were working with her because they've just placed her children in foster care. There wasn't a referral through to adult social care saying we've got somebody with care and support needs who's experiencing domestic abuse. And adult social care got referrals in and were aware this is somebody with children. We need to get better about working across those two services. So there we are.